All right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. I'm extremely humbled, grateful, and honored that we have with us today Mr. Christopher Sharp, based out of the UK. He is the founder of the Liberation Times publication outlet. He is also a contributing journalist to the Daily Mail. In addition to a communication specialist, he's actually broken a handful of stories that have been, disseminated, dare I say, globally. Before we delve into those stories and certain ones I'd love to pick your brain on, how are you doing today, sir? And thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, the pleasure is mine. Thank you so much, Dave. I'm a huge fan of yours. Been watching like many of your interviews. I love the interview that you did with Sean and Lou recently. Just superb. Like the way that you cover the topic is really unique, and like it's such a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I'm really really good. Thank you. It's been a day with me and my son. Didn't want to go to sleep, so the wife's just got here in time.
Nice, nice.
Hopefully his teachers aren't watching and saying, "Oh gosh, he's up at that time." But
Well, actually, speaking of which, before we delve into the UAP UFO topic, I wanted to ask first and foremost, can I ask your, obviously being a contributing journalist to the Daily Mail, um, may I ask your personal perspective on the way in which the Daily Mail covers certain stories or developments? And I say this in a good faith manner because maybe I'm incorrect here, but what I've gathered, whether it's based out of, a European or North American, Western, or, again, the UK, and their publications, the Daily Mail seems to really, dare I say, have a little more scruples than others, whether it's breaking things pertaining to, the Hunter Biden story or what have you. And I'm not trying to get political or divisive, but they seem to break stories I mean, the data and the data they report on speaks for itself in and of itself. So can I ask, in your personal perspective, sir, what you think, or why you think the Daily Mail stands out in that regard compared to others? Because
yeah,
they, to
sure.
me,
I
to
mean,
me, they do. Yeah.
sure. I mean, yeah. Obviously, like there are some very very controversial stories coming out of the Daily Mail, and that's been a historic thing. Certainly, in my lifetime, they've covered stories that may have been controversial. I think that's reflects a bit of the culture of the English newspapers. It's not quite a tabloid, I'd say. It's not like the Sun and the Mirror. So I like to think of it as like between that kind of like newspaper and something like, say, the Telegraph in the UK as well. Also, I mean, I guess you can say that the editorial probably reflects more of kind of like a centre right kind of perspective. But I think if you look at it from a holistic kind of point of view, it's the most read English language news publication in the entire world. And
Right.
it's not just the news stories that like the political stories and stuff that people read, it's the sports stories, the entertainment, and all these other kind of like stuff coming out of it. And people will usually like kind of like read the the latest gossip story or something like that from the Daily Mail, and then there'll be like in the right hand side another story that will come up and about UFOs and stuff like that. And that's how people can kind of like get into this topic. And I think by bringing it to like a larger audience, let's say, I think it's a really really good kind of like thing, especially if we can report it in the correct way, which Josh Boswell, who's the journalist who I'm working with, and myself are trying to do. So I guess, yeah, I mean, you can understand like the context and stuff and the reputation it has, but at the end of the day, I just try and think. I'm all about the topic.
Right.
I'm all about pushing the ball forward. So I can only control what I can control. And for myself, it's an honor kind of like reporting it for the Daily Mail in the context of it's the most read online publication in the English speaking world. So yeah, and I see this as a real good opportunity to report on the story correctly. So it's certainly a pleasure for me.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of which, and again, I don't, with the utmost respect, I don't mean to put you on the spot in any regard, but there's been recently a transition in the last, it would seem to be 3 to 6 years of the masses and the belief of the masses, or at least the ideological view of people going, 5, 10 years ago, if someone had proposed, there was even not a rigid one, but even a loosely uh, conglomerated structure of individuals that have been segregated across different parts of the world pertaining to the control of media and what can and cannot be published, we would have been called a nut job. Nowadays there seems to be a little more, people still call at least me a nut job, but they kind of go, Dave, there may be something there. So without putting you on the spot, do you, sir, have any inclination to potentially be open to the possibility there is a control structure within the Western world of media, the European world of media? Or am I going off too far off the beaten path there?
No, I totally get that. I totally get it. And I mean, I'm also a communication specialist as well. So I've been like on the other side of that, like from public relations, trying to sell stories into journalists and stuff like that. So I've had a bit of experience in terms of that kind of stuff. And I mean, obviously, like when you think of newspapers and stuff, like there always seems to like be a political agenda with most of them. So, you know, in terms of ownership and stuff, you know, you have Rupert Murdoch, for instance, you know, who's quite a conservative kind of figure, and he'll usually be someone who's kind of like supporting those kinds of newspapers to push like an angle out there, and it gives them power. You know, we've seen the same with Jeff Bezos as well, like, you know, owning a newspaper now, so that gives him some influence and power and stuff like that. But I mean, I think it's just like, you know, you sometimes just get, you know, some really powerful kind of individuals, and it kind of like gives them that kind of extra weight, I guess, to get
Right.
their kind of views across, to help their kind of interests, if you're going to look at it that way. But from my personal experience, like working with newspapers and like just getting a story in, it's all about like news values and stuff like that. It's all about like having a good angle to the story. And I think what like the Daily Mail looks for in particular is like visuals. You know, they want to like look very visual in terms of like the images and, you know, potential videos and stuff that you're getting across. And I guess as well, like, you know, stories will sometimes being sensationalized in some newspapers as well. But saying that, I think it's changing. The landscape is rapidly changing as well. So a lot of my stories obviously come out of the Liberation Times. And you're getting lots of kind of like independent publications now, bloggers coming out. And actually, you know, as you saw in the Liberation Times earlier this month, we were the first ones to kind of like break the fact that hearings might be around the corner. And that was before the New York Times, that was before a lot of the other mainstream publications. So I think you're seeing as well that kind of like the established media is coming up against a lot of competition from, you know, grassroots efforts and individuals such as myself and other people online, especially in terms of the UAP topic. And I like to think, you know, that I still do retain that control, you know, so if anyone wants to come up to me saying, you know, Chris, I don't want to report that story, I'm kind of like, that's fine. You know, I've still got my own publication, but for the record, I've never been told that by the Daily Mail. And, you know, they've got such a, you know, like my relationship with Josh is so good, and he's such a cool guy. And
Well, if I
life is just fantastic.
right, if I could say, I don't mean to create a sort of gotcha question pertaining to the Daily Mail. As a matter of fact, quite to the contrary, I think the Daily Mail has done, in my humble opinion, a very good job of balancing out different developments and stories and trying to show both perspectives relative to a perspective that is not you that is unique compared to the rest of what the media is saying out there. And to speak to that, you had a superb story that I remember Mr. Ross Coulthart actually brought to my attention back in, I think, around Christmas time, pertaining to the exclusive you did with The Sun from your, of course, your publication, The Liberation Times. And I'm just reading here from mysteriousuniverse.org. Writer Christopher Sharp released an interview with a former U.S. Air Force nuclear weapons technician who claims he saw an orb during a nuclear weapon transport and a 6-foot tall shadow person inside a secure area of Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri between 2003 and 7. Now, what's interesting here is that, and I quote, according to, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Adrian Reister, nothing was ever reported because if you did, you might be considered mentally unstable and have your clearance and PRP status, PRP stands for Personal Reliability Program, revoked, end quote. Does this, I want to ask you this in correspondence with what I just asked about a control structure. Do you, or a potential one, do you see for example, people like in this particular case, just so I don't, Mr. Reister, do you see someone like him being more comfortable in coming forward compared to, say, 5-10 years ago, where he probably would have not even potentially spoken to anybody?
Absolutely, yeah, that's a really good question, Dave. Yeah, definitely. I think I don't think he would have come out. I don't want to speak on behalf of him, obviously, but I don't know. I just don't see that kind of person have. I don't see any like major stories of lots of witnesses coming out of the shadows like they are now. And it's not just Adrian. You know, I've got some other stories that are going to be broken quite soon of other military veterans as well who are now coming out of the shadows to tell their story because they've seen what's on the news. They've been on UFO Twitter and they see now that the stigma is actually fading away. So now they feel that they're not going to be called a crackpot or a loon for coming out. And in actual fact, you know, like Adrian has so much courage and he's such a hero. And I like to think because he came out and told his story, that others are going to be emboldened to come out as well and have the courage to actually tell their own stories. So yeah, I mean, that's how I think about it. And yeah, obviously, like there's a lot of stigma, especially like in the US Air Force and stuff like that. And it's all to do with the culture and stuff like that within there that you'll be laughed at. And you know, especially if you want to get high, if you want a promotion and stuff like that in the US Air Force or even the US Navy, it doesn't help if you're reporting UFOs. And that needs to change. And that's the stigma that I believe that people like Chris, Sean, and Lou are trying to tackle right now, especially within the US Air Force, whereby you will actually be able to, you know, there'll be a safe space, let's say, where you can actually report such sightings. Because if you read the latest Chris Mellon piece, for example, it seems as though naval aviators and US Air Force pilots are actually kind of training in the same areas. And the naval aviators are reporting UFO sightings and stuff like that. And, you know, they may even be seeing it on the radar and stuff. And that's all being reported. But the US Air Force pilots who are training in those same areas, they're reporting nothing, complete silence from them. So yeah, I think in terms of that, you know, it does come from the top, you know, and pilots need to be briefed saying, look, there's no stigma with this anymore. We really want you to actually come forward. And, you know, we assure you that if you do come forward with reports, it's not going to have any impact on your career. We're not going to think you're crazy or anything like that. Just please come forward, because obviously this is now really high priority for national security.
Right. Thank you. Well, speaking of which, I did want to ask actually, and sort of in real time, compare notes, if you will, pertaining to United States Naval Intelligence and the United States Air Force. Have you, sir, found, again, not without having to divulge any sensitive information, of course, have you found a I don't want to throw a blanket term on neither naval intelligence or the United States Air Force, because I'm certain there are genuinely very good people up and down the chain in there, truly. But have you found any type of culture of suppression or fear intimidation, particularly between the Air Force and naval intelligence, that seems to be, or seem to you to be, more prominent than in other branches of the Department of Defense or the military?
Good question. Good question. I mean, I haven't spoken to many Navy guys personally, so I find it quite hard to contrast that. But also, I'd say the US Army as well. I would say that without giving too much away, there may
Right.
be some stigma and lack of protocol within there as well. Maybe even witness intimidation, according to maybe one source or two. So I mean that might exist. And when we're looking at that and where that's actually coming from, it's very difficult because in terms of chain of command and stuff, you know, you just have one person telling, you know, a
Yeah.
sergeant something. Okay, that guy saw a UFO. Tell him to shut up. Tell him to shut up and not talk about it. But then
Yeah.
again, you don't know who that sergeant got that order from, and the person who gave that order, you may do you know what I mean? It could just go from this person to this person.
It scales up because it scales because of the compartmentalization, right? And exactly,
that's it.
Right, right. Wow. Okay. I appreciate such a, truthfully, sir, such a candid answer, because a lot of people that I've asked, whether on or off the record, have really been hesitant in that regard, especially not so much pertaining to naval intelligence, but more so to the Air Force. Now, one more thing I did want to ask before asking about another division of the government. Have you found, in your humble opinion, and I want to be clear for the audience, whether watching or listening, this is not a jab at anything pertaining to anything negative pertaining to the occult, but have you found an occult-based culture or influence anywhere in the Air Force or in other branches of the United States, either Army or government? And again, for better or worse is not for me to say. Just I say occult very blanketly.
I wouldn't say so much that, but I would say that there is some kind of like evangelical influence there.
Okay.
And I mean, if you look at all these stories about COLLIN'S elite, for example, that have been around for a long time in terms of these individuals, let's say, who are very, very high up, have a lot of influence. And there is even also the rumor as well, obviously just speculation here, that Garry Reid was kind of acting on their behalf. And I would say that there is actually a Netflix documentary about one of the evangelical groups. I'm forgetting the name of now, but we can maybe put it in the notes or something afterwards.
Sure.
But it's basically penetrated US politics, political parties, and also it's penetrated like you know, the DoD and the bureaucratic side of the government as well. I find that quite troubling, because if you do look at like the history of this group, it's got quite a controversial history as well, which is what the documentary is about. And I really wish I remembered the name of them now. But yeah, it's very, very
MJ12.
No, it's not MJ12. It's actually I say it's a well-known one, but I can't remember the name at the moment. Let me just see if I can find it quickly. Religious.
No problem at all. We actually, while you're looking for this, I will read out to the audience that, okay, apparently now, again, I want to be very clear and vigilant that I am not reading the official COLLIN'S elite definition, because depending on where you look, it's sort of scattered, so to speak. But I guess that speaks to, you know, the whole point of this. But the concept behind the COLLIN'S elite is that this is a group of loosely conglomerated and associated individuals across various institutions and entities and departments and programs of the United States federal government, and I believe more so specifically within the Department of Defense, that hold a perspective that all and any, if not, or at the very least, the vast majority of what we call, you know, unidentified aerial phenomenon and the inhabitants, the alleged inhabitants of said craft or of said, you know, bodies of craft are demonic no matter what. This is apparently based on evangelical upbringing that, in my own personal research, I want to be clear, not speaking on behalf of Mr. Sharp here, in my own personal research, I found to be quite avid and prominent within the United States Air Force. Interesting that, again, it's in within the same branch that is, I guess you could say, that is guarded to protect the skies of America. So, you know, interesting that that's the case, as well as naval intelligence pertaining to USOs, unidentified submerged objects. So as I understand it, COLLIN'S elite, they're basically a group of individuals that kind of just go, nope, anything, you know, anything that one could view potentially, not saying this is correct, but view potentially as new science is just, you know, demonic, too bad, you know, go screw off, so to speak. Would that be a fair assumption to make, sir?
I can clarify that. One moment, because you were saying about naval intelligence, and I found it really important in terms of USOs. And I mean, that's something, from my understanding, they've not been so forthcoming about, because it seems that the USOs, like UFOs, for example, they're attracted to nuclear technology, nuclear assets. And when talking about USOs, it's the nuclear submarines. So I can understand why they're being very, very secretive about that, because that's the nuclear deterrent. So it's kind of like of the utmost importance that you keep those assets secret in terms of where their location is and stuff like that. So I think it's very, very unlikely that you'll ever hear many, or if any, reports about like USO incidents involving nuclear submarines, just for the purposes that you have to keep those assets safe, and you
Right.
can't give out the kind of like location of them. And the more intelligence you provide your enemies, the more likelihood of that happening. And just on the flip side there as well, there is, if you read Tom Rogan's excellent article in the Washington Examiner, there is a real fear here that China and Russia may be back engineering technology. And if they back engineer the technology, they may have the capability that UFOs do, that seemingly are able to actually find any nuclear asset, even hidden nuclear assets the US has. And that provides them the possibility of neutralizing the nuclear deterrent of America. And that puts the whole world in danger. That's why it's so important.
Right. Okay. So following along that train of thought there, what is the regardless of the department, the agency, you name it, or the people that you've spoken to on or off the record, what is the most consistent understanding that you've been told that you can speak on publicly of this phenomenon, that they're have you received, for example, a most common answer of, oh, they're us from the future, or they're this or that? If I may ask, I am of the humble opinion, not to be a cop-out answer here, a cop-out guy, but I'm of the opinion it's probably all of the above. But if I may ask, what is the most consistent or common thing that you are told off the record, on the record, that parallels with your research?
Sure, sure. I mean, in all honesty, like I can be really forthcoming about this, and the sources that I speak to, at least, are basically just saying that we still don't definitively know what it is, which is why now we're going into these public hearings just to find out the origin, because Congress is getting repeat off at the moment, because they keep on getting these reports showing, oh yeah, more UFOs, and a lot of them may be quite threatening, or not threatening, they could be quite, let's just say, alarming. And you keep on getting these reports, basically, but no one seems to be doing anything to find out what the origin is, where they come from, what the intent is, and all these other things, basically. And it just can't go on like this. So that's from my understanding, just kind of like from DOT people that I speak to. But I mean, I think maybe like high up in the Air Force, maybe in the Department of Energy, that's where you get a little bit more advanced, potentially, if people who actually do understand a lot more about this issue, and inside some SAPs and stuff like that. So if I
SAP,
could,
sorry, just to clarify, SAP for the audience stands for Special Access Program. And thank you for bringing up the DOE, Department of Energy. I was going to ask you about that next, but please finish your thoughts. Sorry.
no, of course. But I think if you can kind of like penetrate those kind of bodies, then I think you could potentially find a lot more about what is actually going on in terms of the original intent and stuff like that, especially as the DOE is kind of like controlling a lot of like, well, most of all the nuclear assets and stuff like that, and is actually tasked with defending the nuclear weapons that the US has. So, I mean, yeah, I think that's a really, really sensible place to start. And also there is, this relationship between the US Air Force and DOE as well, and that, Kirtland Air Force Base, for example, you've got the United Air Force there, and also you've kind of got the DOE there as well, which is like they have a function there, from my understanding, of actually protecting the nuclear weapons of the US. So, I mean, a lot of these bases, they perhaps may be working together.
Okay, now speaking of which, have you heard by chance of the term, I believe it's been coined by Mr. Jacques Vallée, called the Invisible College?
Yes, yes.
Okay, could you explain very briefly, your understanding of the Invisible College for the audience, and then I'll get to my question on that.
Sure. So it's a group of elite kind of like scientists,
Academics.
studying slash academics, yes, studying studying the phenomena from a variety of like different perspectives, in terms of like, biological impacts, the physics repercussions, engineering, just all this stuff, basically. and they kind of like have this kind of like network where they, speak with each other and kind of like swap notes and stuff like that, and kind of like collaborate. But it's all kind of like done underneath the surface, and from my understanding, they'll never kind of admit that they are in this kind of like secret college. So
Right. So the idea is that they, and please forgive me if you think that I'm taking this out of context, but the idea behind the Invisible College, similar to Collins Elite, is that they're ideologically driven. They may be scientists and academics scattered across, academia, in the Department of Defense, you name it. But would you allegedly they are responsible for, better or worse is not for me to say, and I think it can go both ways when we look at that, but we'll put that aside for a second. They seem to be the gatekeepers of a lot of these quote unquote extremely advanced materials science knowledge or materials knowledge. Um, Again, we see, for example, recently from ATIP and the DIA, we see the 38 technical papers that were done in 2009, 2010, which were given to BAS by the DIA and all of that. Now, what's interesting about this is that we have Dr. Eric Davis on Stephen Greenstreet's The Basement Office, I think last year or the year prior, talking about how there was much more that came out of ATIP than just the 38 technical papers. But the issue, the conflicting issue was that they were concerned, the individuals within ATIP were concerned that leadership, if briefed on certain elements and aspects of the program, would not be forthcoming because of their ideological beliefs that we discussed pertaining to things like Collins Elite. And so these individuals, certain ones, not accusing anyone of anything, to be clear, held back a lot of the findings, developments, knowledge, you name it. What I'm essentially getting at here is, would you, in your humble opinion, think that if you had to sort of put your wager or put your money on where some of that may or may not have gone, the Department of Energy may be that maybe not the only branch, but a key branch? And I say this because it's been alleged that the DOE has not had strict oversight for arguably ever, but
yeah, I mean, obviously, Department of Energy, you've got Battelle, you've got lots of Animos and all these other separate places. Basically, it seemed very, very decentralized in terms of how it's all scattered around and stuff.
sorry, when you say Battelle, you say Battelle Memorial Institute?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, Yeah, and if you listen to Jacques Vallée, for instance, there was an incident over Washington in the 1950s where they flew over the White House, and he claims that they shot at the object, and actually some material came off of it, and that went straight to Battelle. And I find that really interesting. And also, as well, if you've ever watched, well, I think you probably have, The Phenomenon, Jacques Vallée, he's saying how they're investigating Project Blue Book, and he found evidence that there was a parallel, much better funded investigation going on at the same time, involving Battelle as well. So I find that really, really interesting.
Well, I think Major Donald Kehoe in 1958, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that he went on. I think, forgive me if it was CBS, NBC. He went on a station, and his feed was cut because he said something that I think it seemed as though, maybe I'm incorrect here, he felt was sort of weighing on his conscience. Pertaining to the real truth behind Project Blue Book. And I'm just paraphrasing. He had said something along the lines of, if anyone truly looks into this or has access to the information that I've had, you could tell that you will know immediately it's not of, at least of this planet knowingly, and it is intelligently controlled. And that's when right before then they seem to have cut his feed there. Is that that makes sense, correct?
I think some of those who were deeply involved with Project Blue Book had the tools and the understanding and experience and knowledge to know that it was actually potentially not of this world. I definitely believe that. I think it goes quite deep, but also I believe that, in my opinion, I think there was something much more secretive than Blue Book, and the people involved with that probably had a much better understanding about what was going on due to the funds and resources that they had at their disposal. And we're maybe talking kind of investigations here that had access to materials and maybe even bodies, let's say, as well. So I think if you want to really kind of like look to see where it was, I think, if you're looking at the DOE, that's probably, the correct direction to look at.
The Department of Energy, because we see it was officially founded in 1977, and what's quite peculiar is that there seems to have been an unofficial DOE operating prior to then, based on the Manhattan Project and in correspondence to the Atomic Energy Commission that was headed by Edward Teller. And again, we see that, again, depending on, Bill Uhouse, Mr. Lazar, not saying that they are truthful nor untruthful in their statements, depending on each own person's respective views on that. Have you, by any chance, I mean, when we had Mr. John Greenwald on from the Black Vault, we brought up an article from the LA Times from, I think it was the 80s, where we talked about, again, there was a something like you could, to me it screamed money laundering. I'm not saying that's what it was, but I saw, $75 screws, $2,000 toilets, something like this. That screams to me as inflating the cost of everything to launder the money. But at the same time, have you come across in your research, without respectfully putting you in a corner, anything having to do with black money or in money laundering within the Pentagon that funded some of these legacy programs that may have been transferred to private contractors down the road?
So I know that there was like literally like billions of missing money in the Pentagon. I think it was Donald Rumsfeld who kind of like spoke out about that in 2001. Yeah, I really, I mean, from experience of working with contractors and stuff like that in my job, we know that obviously sometimes the jobs, they get bloated in terms of the budgets and stuff like that. So maybe that's one aspect of it. Maybe it's black projects, but I mean, somewhere along the line, they seem to have lost track of where the money is actually going. And in terms of inflated costs, I'm not sure. It's very, very difficult in terms of actually finding out, especially if you're working with like really exotic technologies and stuff like that. It's very difficult to kind of like contrast it to anything to actually say this is really, really inflated.
Right.
I mean, also it must be very, very difficult auditing these black projects as well, and actually where the money is going. But I mean, something seems amiss. I mean, who knows? I mean, there's a lot of corruption in governments across the world. Just literally everywhere. Like you look at my wife's country, for instance, Philippines, corruption is rife there,
Right.
across all of government. I don't know, in terms of the US, they seem to have a better record than other governments, but I mean, who knows where that money is going? It really is a mystery, and I think a lot of people would like to find out where that missing money is.
Oh, right. Now, speaking of which, to add on to that, have any of your sources, again, whether on or off the record, said to you, or even in your own research, have you found one of two cases to be the situation? Anyone has potentially, I'm paraphrasing here, said, Chris, there's some of us that want this stuff to come out, but, for example, again, we have, for example, 2001 or the year 2000, Don Phillips, former Lockheed Skunk Works, let me see, former Lockheed Martin Skunk Works division, excuse me, USAF, CIA, private contractor. He was talking about how in the early to mid 80s, if I'm not mistaken, they had handheld devices that could scan and treat and cure the body of a good chunk of what we call cancers. And he said, well, the beloved FDA, and because of all this getting out, it would, rupture the power structures of the world, big oil, big energy, all this kind of stuff. And my research has found two major things that have caused a lot of this to allegedly be kept secret, regardless of what this is. First off, a lot of these individuals simply embarrassed that they've been lying for so long. They don't know how to come clean in a way that covers themselves in a legal sense and what have you. In addition to what I just mentioned there about, again, the suppression and all that. So, have you found this to be the case on your end, sir, or am I going left field there?
No, certainly not. I mean, I've spoken to so just from my own personal experience here, nothing UAP related or anything like that, but just talking to people. I know one former army veteran, for example, who told me that during the 1990s, the British Army had something, very, very similar to what we would have as a smartphone right now. So the technology was very, very advanced.
This was when, sorry, in the 90s?
In the 90s, yeah, that's what he claimed to me. And there was another guy as well. He recently passed away, sadly, and he worked in the Royal Navy between the 1950s and 1980s. He retired just before the Falklands War, I believe. And I asked him, I said, look, is there technology that you know of we still don't know about today, but if we did know about, would blow our minds? And the answer was yes. And a lot of, well, that still hasn't seen the light of day.
I believe. Okay, so to add to that question, I was told by someone off the record that slide 9 that leaked from that alleged leak from Mr. Christopher Mellon's private server, pertaining to the alteration manipulation of biological organisms, transmedium, a unique human cognitive interface, and at the very bottom it said what was once considered science fiction is now quantum physics or something along those lines. I was told myself off the record, Dave, that's a conservative list. Would you have you been told anything similar by chance? Maybe not exactly pertaining to slide 9, but pertaining to the technologies being discussed surrounding slide 9.
That's a really good question. And I think in terms of the quantum, I mean, there are two great mysteries in science at the moment. The first is quantum physics and how it works. For example, the two-slit experiment, quantum entanglement. It seems that there is no consensus. I mean, even haunted Einstein until his death, and he kind of like,
No
quantum
consensus reality, because it's been proposed that Einstein was going off of Heaviside equations and not Maxwell's. So apparently he was starting on a basis that was already deliberately butchered, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, no, it seems to be the case. And he was calling it spooky action at a distance. But and there's obviously the other thing as well, which is consciousness, which seems to be a very, very mysterious thing that science still can't really understand and grasp. And I think that you've had Stuart Hammerhoff kind of like discuss this in terms of consciousness and the link between that being quantum physics with the microtubules. And I find that really, really compelling in terms of what they're kind of like saying. And also, like I would say as well, another good guy is Robert Lanza as well. He's got this theory called biocentrism, which kind of like links kind of like biology with quantum physics. So for instance, like we only see things through the apparatus of our mind, like Lou Elizondo said a lot of times, we can only actually see we can only like see like 0.0.1% of reality. We can't see microwaves, we can't see radio waves, we can't see any of that. Like our
We're only
brain
absorbing
waves.
Right, we're only absorbing certain photonic information structures relative to what our brains can perceive within the light spectrum. And even that in of itself is, dare I say, a potential dare I don't want to say disadvantage, but again, as you had said, the way in which, for example, right now there's an organic biosensor that is electromagnetically sending a signal to my brain telling me I am holding this pen, right? And but it takes time for that to get to the brain and interpret. So I think what you're saying is there could be things all around us we wouldn't even realize.
That's correct. Yeah, and reality is very, very subjective as well. All it takes is a little bit of kind of engineering, let's say, and a geneticist can, every time you see the color green, a geneticist can make you see the color purple. So I mean, it's just how our brains actually filter reality, and we kind of like think that that is the real reality that our brains actually filter out.
I find it interesting. That speaks to, whether for better or worse is not for me to say, but that speaks to the phrase, it's not, unfortunately it's not how it is, it's how it appears to be.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I wanted to touch on as well, I mean, obviously being the founder of Liberation Times, what motivated you to start Liberation Times? And I say this in a purely good faith, positive way. I think we need more people like yourself, and I think Liberation Times needs to actually be exposed in a more prominent manner globally. But what inspired you?
I actually quit my job in July 2021. It was just getting too much for me. I was like working 6 a.m. to 12 midnight. My wife's a nurse. She was working really long hours as well. And we had to look after my son. And it just, without going into too much detail, it just wasn't working out. I was feeling the pressure. So I was thinking, I cannot do this anymore. So I quit my job. I intended to go freelance in terms of what I do with comms. But just so happened I had 2 months where I was being paid without doing work, which is fantastic. So I decided, okay, what do I do in that spare time? So I got really bored. And in my previous job, I'd learned how to create websites and stuff. And I thought, actually, let's just create like a UFO kind of like website. Let's not call it like UFO Dungeon or something like that. It's call it Liberation Times. It seems a little bit more legitimate. And it just started from that. And I mean, like the first stories were just like very, very basic, and it wasn't all UFOs at first either. But then, kind of like I was talking to my friends who would give me advice, and they said, look, just focus on the UFO stuff and add a bit more analysis and stuff like that. And then you'll have some really good stories. And it just, yeah, it spiraled from there, and it just like took off. And I had, Lou, Elizondo, Christopher Mellon, retweeting my articles, Tom DeLonge, and even Leslie Keane, and people like that were kind of like sharing my articles, and it just came from nowhere, and suddenly this like big thing is happening. And I mean, there were people, conspiracy theorists, that say, sorry, one second.
Sure, no problem.
So there were people, I think, at the time, just saying, "Oh, I wonder where this is." Like it was some kind of conspiracy, like some person in the U.S. government who kind of like been behind Liberation Times, and they were looking into my background and stuff like that. They thought like I was a government agent. I was like,
Oh,
literally,
an intelligence controlled opposition agent.
it was the funniest thing ever. It was like I literally just got really bored one day because I was doing nothing, and I created this website. I write all the articles from my son's bedroom with dinosaurs around me.
But if I could say, Chris, I think that speaks to the concept of, again, it's not so much about, people say, oh, you got to have this, even on my end too, this extremely, high end studio, all this kind of stuff. I think people are just hungry for knowledge, and they're starting to realize, and they're hungry for data, and they're starting to realize, okay, it's great when we turn on the TV and we see this nice big studio or this and that, and everything looks good, but the information they're conveying from that studio is like, dare I say, not exactly delivered in a way that many of us probably would prefer to have it delivered to us as.
Yeah, I think that obviously there's a lot of like mixed views out there in terms of people's truths, let's say, and the narrative that they're actually carrying. Um, I mean, at the end of the day, I have my opinions in terms of what's going on, but I'm not attached to those opinions. If the facts change, then I'm ready to kind of like change my opinions. But a lot of my sources who are highly credible are telling me stuff, and like I can't think of any better sources, that are actually telling me this, and I have to report what they're saying in my stories at the end of the day. But yeah.
This is what I find quite interesting. And again, this is not a jab or attack at anyone whatsoever. And I genuinely mean that. I find it quite peculiar that even not just today, but even, many years ago, I think this speaks to the, as Hal Puthoff said on Jesse Mitchell's show with Eric Weinstein, how the Stigma program worked quite well on the masses, because, and I must admit, even to myself, it did too. If you had asked me 6 months ago, would I consider truly the possibility of what we call shape-shifting reptilians, I would say, I'm not sure. But now, reading academic papers, looking into how light waves and, science can, seemingly indicate or at least lead us to a handful of conclusions, and that being one of them, it's like, oh wow, okay. So essentially, overall, when you take a look at the situation at hand pertaining to UAP, UFOs, and all of this, do you find that it's sort of been situated into factions, dare I say, or elements within the United States government? And I say relative to also the NATO umbrella, because I've in my own research I found that if you went to any European country or any other nation, except a handful, obviously, and asked about UFOs and all of that, they would say you got to go to the Americans.
There's different tiers at the end of the day. So, I mean, probably about 99.9% of people in the US government do not know what's going on in terms of UAP to a varying degree. Obviously, there's some people have a better understanding and stuff.
Right.
Um, but I think kind of like when you're, let's say the Public Affairs Office in the Pentagon, for instance, people in there may have not been read into what's going on, and they may just think it's all a bunch of rubbish in terms of UAP. But they didn't have the they haven't been in a skiff with Lou Elizondo before. The people who are actually surrounding Lou and Chris Mellon, who kind of had like such good access to this stuff, and they're in a position. If you had like 10 years ago or 20 years ago, if you wanted to like speak to anyone about UAP, you would go to someone like a Christopher Mellon, you would go to someone like a Lou Elizondo to actually find that information out. Okay, now these people are actually speaking, so they understand a lot more of it than a lot of other people. And in terms of the kind of like lower ranks and stuff like that, I think that's where a lot of the stigma is, in terms of the US government, especially the DoD. And they kind of like laugh at it and stuff like that. And that may be coming from higher up in terms of like that stigma attitude. Those people who are in higher authorities that do have an understanding of what's going on about UAP, let's say they are COLLIN'S elite and they don't want this information out, it's in their best interest to kind of like keep that alive, Garry Reid, for instance, if I'm a COLLIN'S elite faction guy who's briefing Garry Reid, and let's say he's doesn't know a lot about UAP, I'm just saying, oh, it's just a load of rubbish.
Right.
Lou Elizondo is talking absolute utter nonsense. This is all just like la la land stuff. They've gone crazy. That's what I'd probably be feeding into those kinds of people. That's how it works, because as human beings, we're group think creatures at the end of the day. And I mentioned before, a lot of people, especially in the military, they're afraid of not getting promotions, possibly losing their jobs and stuff like that. It does not help you if you're talking about UFOs, which has been a fringe topic for so long. Let's say if you work in like finance in the city of London, for example, and you're managing like, portfolios worth billions of pounds.
Right.
Okay, now let's say that one lunchtime you're having a lunch with some of your colleagues and a client, and you start talking about UFOs. What do you think is going to happen to your career? This is the thing, because it really does
Yeah.
harm you. That's using a real world kind of like situation in the workplace to show how it might work, and you wouldn't say
Right.
it.
And based on your research and your extensive time that you've delved into this topic, of course, have you found potentially that there has deliberately been a I don't want to say an official system, but a again, I don't want to use the word rogue either, because I don't want that to be taken the wrong way, but a system of sorts within the system of government that has been set up to deliberately ensure, or at least loosely ensure, that some type of formal UFO reporting office or anything like this could not be constructed in a good faith manner up until recently, of course. What I'm speaking on is, say, the last 60, 70 years, right? You'd have one person, Air Force pilot, that reports missing time and radiation burns, for example, just hypothetically. He tries to report it to do the right thing. He loses his pension. He loses, his wife, his kids leave him, the whole thing. Have you found that to be the case, that there may have been we see, for example, without taking his words out of context, Dr. Hal Puthoff saying to Eric Weinstein and Jesse Mitchell's, there were certain things that were done so that FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests, couldn't even provide certain data because they just simply didn't have it. Do you see that being a possibility? And I want to add on that, add to that after this.
You got John Burroughs, for example, involved with the Rendlesham case, couldn't get access to his home medical records. So that's a really, really good case in point there. Obviously, there is something going on. I think that the bureaucracy, let's say, has been structured in such a way which may have started after the Roswell, event when all these new bodies were established that seems to be preventing outsiders, let's say, from penetrating this core of secrets
Right.
in terms of UAP. I think you've got a really good point there. And I think as well, there may be some antagonism coming from those people. Like we were saying earlier, you know, it's like, what, you know, how do you find out who the real orders are coming from?
Right. When it's so compartmentalized to the point where even the guys running the compartments may not even know the full scope of the, yeah.
Correct, yeah. So how do you know? Where does that end, you know? How can you follow that? Especially, you know, when you're, you know, if you're like a normal infantryman, you're not
Right.
going to investigate, you're not going to investigate your sergeant. If you're the sergeant and you got it from the colonel, okay, you're not going to investigate the colonel. If you're the colonel and you got it from the general, you're not going to investigate the general and see where did you get it.
Right. And
Yeah.
this speaks to it, what I was saying as well as of not a confirmed, but a potential or alleged system within a system, or I don't want to say, you know, shadow system or shadow government, but again, it's interesting because again, I must, although I actually hold on, I won't bring that up, but if we go back to the 2001 National Press Club conference, we see there, and I must give Mr. Greer credit where it's due, in my humble opinion, for that effort and initiative 20 odd years ago. We see, for example, if I'm not mistaken, Miss Carol Rosin, if I'm without taking her words out of context, discussed how you could have, say, a lieutenant, or you can have, say, a petty officer know more about the UFO UAP topic than their superior, and so on and so forth, almost as if there's an alternative, subtle, again, off the books association or club or group or compartment or compartments that you can somehow do it where, again, as Miss Rosin, I believe, said at NASA, you know, we're sitting there and I have a top secret clearance and others have much higher clearances, but somehow I know more about this than they do. And she goes, I don't know how they can do it, make it so that certain people know and certain people don't, but she's like, they do make it happen. So you see what I'm saying there? That seems to speak to again, I'm not trying to get all, you know, conspiratorial and what have you, but it seems to speak to a suppression of something over the last many decades.
That's interesting. It could just be a case of actually just identifying allies who have the necessary expertise that you're interested in. Look at Lou Elizondo, for instance. You know, he was seen by Bukowski as having like some really, really good credentials and being a good fit to kind of like leading the ATIP effort. However, Lou's boss, Garry Reid, had no idea what he was doing, even though he was higher rank. But it would make sense to go to Lou rather than Garry Reid because Lou had the correct kind of experience and skills to actually look into it.
That's a very, wow, what a good example. Wow. I did want to read from your site, sir, liberationtimes.com. Liberation Times, and I quote, spoke to former ATIP director Lou Elizondo about the prospect of hearings. Elizondo cautioned that Amnesty would play an important role in the success of any possible hearings. And before I go on, I believe Mr. Ross Coulthart has mentioned the same as well, too. But Mr. Elizondo said, and I quote, equally important is providing Congress and the American people with any information concerning UAPs obtained through legacy efforts to include insights gleaned and lessons learned. Furthermore, in our fervor to understand the truth, we must ensure this does not become a witch hunt, especially if public hearings become a reality. Instead, I suggest we offer some sort of amnesty in order that individuals who may have historically been associated with this topic can provide their insights freely and without fear. Only then can we ensure Congress, the executive branch, and the American people receive the information that they deserve, end quote. I really wanted, okay, this, forgive me if this is a long-winded question, but I really wanted to I've really harped on this proposal, whether it's from Mr. Elizondo or Mr. Coulthart, about this amnesty program, similar to, I think, what was done in Rwanda, where there was a guarantee many years ago based on the ones behind the genocide that if they would come forward, there would be sort of like a quid pro quo. Okay, you come forward, you lay all of it out on the table. You tell everyone everything you did, and in return you get some type of amnesty, and your family gets put into some, if need be, witness protection type situation, if you will, in order to move on. And the reason I wanted to bring this up, sir, is because I really, really am trying to toe the line, even with my own show. I have no problem admitting it. How much should we harp and focus on the past relative to moving forward? Because it's if I found myself admittedly falling down those rabbit holes in some cases. Oh, it's, this person and maybe that person connects to this, but it's like, okay, hold on. That was 30, 40 years ago. Now, if it has significance relating to future progression, that's one thing. But to just harp on it for the sake of, like Mr. Elizondo said, becoming a witch hunt, that's when I start to say, okay, I can understand to an extent why this amnesty program may work, and may possibly be the only path to work, because there's no official process to get to do all this, right? So do you, in other words, do you agree with this amnesty proposal? Do you think it's necessary based on obviously your on and off the record chats? Do you think that again, as I understand it, the over my dead body silo, as Eric Weinstein said, seems to be losing ground. So do you think amnesty in this regard would be the way to go?
I do, yes, but let's see it from two different perspectives here.
Sure.
So firstly, let's have a look at the situation right now. I think I've said it before, we can't go on like we're in the 1800s, 1700s, 1600s, 1500s anymore, having wars and stuff like that, playing nations off against each other. One wrong move in the Ukraine and we're all dead. Everything on this planet is dead. Zilch. No more chances. That's gone. Wiped out. Boom. So that's it, basically. And we can't mess around anymore. We need to get this information out. However, look at it from a different perspective here. Rightfully, there are people who are going to be very, very aggrieved about this. People who have lost their jobs, lost their families, lost everything because they came out about it. And that is wrong. And I will never kind of like pardon the people responsible for that, I will never forgive them. I will never just say, I will never have a drink for them, for example.
Because ultimately, if you go up the food chain, they're the reason that person lost everything.
Absolutely.
Right.
But then again, let's change the perspective. They may have done it for a very good reason. I mean, there's the whole kind of, let's have a look, there's a story, isn't there, about, a scenario where someone's on a bridge and, it's and there's a railway below it, and there's a train coming towards the bridge, and you could either there's a person on one railway tracks, and you could like save them from throwing a rock on the railway, or but then if you did that, then you could put everyone at risk because it's near a cliff, let's say, or you could just basically let the kind of like train go, basically. So what do you choose? Do you choose to kind of like save the girl who's tied to the railway tracks, or do you choose to kind of just let the train go because it may be at risk of killing everyone? It's kind of like one of those things. Maybe they done that. Maybe so. It was a rubbish analogy that I used.
No, but I see it's that there's no genuine answer with respects to how can we have a win-win-win situation.
Yeah, basically. So I mean, it could have been that you basically ruined that person's life because what you were trying to protect was at the interests of like hundreds of millions of people that could be put at risk if they knew the information. And it started this kind of like whole show where everyone was getting scared, or
that's that Thanos type situation where you sacrifice a few for the many. And that, I'm not saying I agree nor disagree with that. I don't know myself where I stand with it, but right.
It's difficult. And at the end of the day, like you have to look at, if you don't have amnesty, it could lead to some really, really ugly places, and we don't have time to mess around anymore. I mean, look at the French Revolution, for instance, and all the killing that went on. You had one revolution, and you had another kind of like set of killings, and
right,
it just gets going.
Where do you draw the line, right? Because that becomes, if you want to go like as quoted in your great publication there, if you want to go on a witch hunt for one person, that leads to another. And just like when you're super happy, you just want more happiness. when you keep going after negative things in that regard, you just want more negativity, and it's kind of like, when does it ever end? Similar to greed, in my opinion. But right, it's fine. It's potentially finding that balance, because that's I hear you. This is the thing of, again, spiraling down a rabbit hole without even realizing it. Okay, we, hypothetically, we witch hunted one of them, now go for the other one, then the other one, and then at what point does that cause instead of taking 2 steps back to take 5 forward, it's now taking 5 back to take 2 forward. So what are you really doing? Yeah.
Absolutely. And the thing is, this is such an urgent topic right now, in terms of what's out there in the public, from our understanding of what's happening in the world at the moment, in terms of climate change, in terms of potential nuclear conflicts. We need to take action on this anymore. We cannot carry on going the same way as we have for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. And once we do get this information out, and let's say we possibly discover new technology, let's say if it's like 0 point energy or something like that, where do we go from there? Where do we go from there? Now let's say we've got 0 point energy, for example, the most powerful kind of like destructive potential force in the world. It could change the world for the better, defeat climate change, defeat pollution, and all these things, but also it takes one person to get a hold of it, and it will cause a scale of destruction, which is,
well, this is a very legitimate point, as it pertains to even I've said it myself before too, pertaining to terrorism and things like this, right? If it is legitimately true and accurate that intelligence agencies, civilian or military intelligence, have issues with certain terrorist cells, and taking away or trying to prevent them from obtaining nuclear materials. Imagine what happens if alleged anti-gravity or 0 point energy gets in their hands. That's like, I mean, at that point you got a real problem. So I hear you. That's a very good point.
Let's lose analogy of the gorilla in the cage, perhaps. And that maybe there's other intelligences that are like, look at these humans, look, they're warring again in Russia, and they're arguing amongst themselves on Twitter all the time. There's violence in the world. Can we really trust these humans with this kind of technology? The answer is no. It's an emphatic no, that we wouldn't be able to be trusted. And that's why I think, in terms of disclosure, there must be another kind of revolution as well, in terms of perhaps, let's say we do gain knowledge of consciousness and how we can aspire to be better and become more civilized, let's say, and less violent. Maybe there's some kind of like secrets that these saps and stuff have found out about such matters. So yeah.
Right, got you. Well, I mean, sir, it's been a fantastic just over 1 hour of a conversation. I Unfortunately, I'm going to have to wrap it up, but could you please tell everyone about your work, where it can be found, where you can be found on social media, and I would love to have you back on the show whenever you'd be available again.
Oh, fantastic. No, it's been a pure pleasure. It really, really has been. Thank you so much. So www.liberationtimes.com is my website, and on Twitter it's @liberationtimes, and then my personal one is Chris UK Sharp is the that's the handle on there. But yeah, I mean, I've got a lot of new stuff coming out, a lot of new exclusive stories. Some will be released in Liberation Times, some will be released in the Daily Mail. And man, I'm just really trying to push this topic forwards as much as I can. If I can push disclosure forward by just like 1 hour, that would be a win in my books,
Man, you're preaching to the choir. You're speaking my language. I can't thank you enough. And from the bottom of my heart, and on behalf of my audience and my Patreon members and all of that, truly thank you so very much, sir, for your time and for your honesty and your knowledge and all of that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.